All right, folks, this is the last osseous tissue lecture, and this is inflammation and repair, or it's actually just repair of fractures, but inflammation is part of it, and then repair. And then how old age affects your bones. That's usually the last part of each chapter. So let's just talk about this first. This is not different. This is not different than the inflammation and repair in chapter 4, and it's not different than the inflammation and repair in the integumentary system chapter. It's going to sound a little bit different because we're talking about repairing a connective tissue called bone. But inflammation is inflammation, and that's going to be the same thing that happened before. And repair is repair. You just got to repair the right tissue. So first of all, we break our bone. All right. So we have some bleeding going on. So here's my hematoma. Here's my bleeding going on right here. And I'm going to clot. I'm going to clot this bleeding, and that's the first step. And I'm going to release inflammatory cytokines like prostaglandins, histamines, and kinins. So inflammatory products are going to be released. And then what happens is this. I form this internal callus right in here. So I have inflammation going on, and I form this internal callus. And the thing with internal calluses and external calluses, by the way, is that they're what we call woven bone. Now, I'll come back and talk about woven bone in a second. But here's my internal callus formed. All right. After that, I form my external callus right here. You can see that I'm starting to lay down woven bone right here, and I form my external callus right in here. All right. And then you can see my periosteum grew back out and around. I repaired my periosteum. That actually repaired before the woven bone was formed, just so you know. Let's be clear about something here. This periosteum repaired itself before woven bone was formed. So step 1, repair your periosteum. Well, actually, step 1, blood clotting. You got to stop from bleeding. Step 2, you repaired your periosteum. Step 3, you made woven bone. Now, what is woven bone? Woven bone is disorganized. It doesn't have lamella. Disorganized. It doesn't follow any particular line of stress. It's just bone that's put in there that's very disorganized, that will hold some weight and some stress, but it's very disorganized, and it's got to be remodeled to the normal spongy and compact bone that we are used to. All right. Now, what happens next is the osteoblast comes in here and replaces my woven bone with spongy bone. That's what we're doing right here. We're replacing woven bone with spongy bone. All right. And then I remodel that to keep the spongy in the center and the compact or dense in my periphery. All right, so let's walk through that again. Erase everything here and walk through that again. You break your bone. Here it is. You got a broken bone. You gotta clot your blood. The blood clotting is going to occur. Your dense irregular connective tissue that we call the periosteum is gonna seal off and repair. All right. Then what you're gonna do is you're going to lay down woven bone as external callus and internal callus. So I'm laying down woven bone here, external callus here, external callus, and I'm laying down woven bone in here as my internal callus. It's very disorganized. All right, it's really just calcification of soft tissue. That's really what it is, without any particular architecture to it. All right, so here I have woven bone that's been ossified. And then my osteoblasts come in here and they remodel all of this. They leave spongy bone in my medullary cavity, but they remodel this and this to compact bone. And that's what you see here. Compact bone here, and this remodel here. Now you can see a slight bump right there, and you can see a slight bump right there. Does that mean when you break a bone, you might have the healed bone might have a slight bump on it? Yeah, it usually does. You've actually just thickened your bone in the area of the break. And that's just because you made the bone stronger where it was under a particular amount of stress. Now this can take a long time. Now how come they don't? How come you have to be on fractures? How come you have to be on crutches for say 4 months or whatever? I mean, it depends on what bone you break, obviously, but they give you a period of time because you can't put weight on woven bone. Well, I mean I got to be careful because remember this is how it always is in biology. I have 100% woven bone right here. All right. Now, do I change all 100% into spongy bone immediately? No, I have a little spongy bone going on here and some woven. So I have some woven and some spongy at any during this repair process. And then my ratios just change. More spongy, less woven. Even more spongy and even less woven. Even more spongy and even less woven until eventually it's all spongy. And then, do I go from all spongy to all compact immediately? No, I start adding compact in here and I have mostly spongy, a little compact. Less spongy, more compact, and and so on and so forth. But you can't put weight on woven bone. It actually could screw up your healing process. So the doctors are going to make you be on crutches and keep weight off of it until they know about the right amount of time where you're going to have some spongy bone in here. Now you can start putting weight on spongy bone, and in fact you should, because when you remodel that spongy bone, you want it to be remodeled in the way that you are putting stress on that bone. So you don't want to be on crutches the entire time either, but you definitely don't want to put weight on the spongy bone. So that's what I think it says that in your book when you read that. But that's why they make you keep weight off it for a certain period of time, but then they want you to maybe with a little bit of discomfort start walking because you got to let your bone remodel itself and be strong in the areas where it needs to be strong. All right, so you got the fracture, you have the hematoma and blood clotting. You have the internal callus and external callus forming here and here. Remember, it's very disorganized, woven bone. All right, it doesn't follow any particular pattern. It's just getting calcified soft tissue in there until you can remodel it. So you got your internal and external callus formation. Now you start forming your spongy bone, and then you remodel it into compact bone and spongy bone. All right, that's the collage. That's fractures. Let's pick a couple fractures to know. I usually go with this Pott's fracture. I actually usually go with Coley's fracture. Do I not? I'm looking. This looks like it might be Coley's, right? Well, it's either this one or this one. I can't tell what this is. I can't tell if that's the tibia fibula, I think. Yeah, that's the tib fib. Whoop. So that's not the one. Wish I had the book on me right now. Yeah, it's got to be this one. Coley's. And this must be the bimalleolar. Anyway. Let's know two fractures. This is a bimalleolar fracture. That means two malleoluses. Your two malleoluses are your medial malleolus, which is part of your tibia, and your lateral malleolus, which is part of your fibula. Does that mean that you fracture both bones? Yep. Malleolus. And it's a bimalleolar fracture. You fracture both of these. And your Coley's fracture is a forearm fracture, and it usually happens in kids. And they have if you ever see a kid whose forearm is hanging, like when he holds his arm out, his forearm's hanging down, that's likely a Pott's fracture. I actually had a friend in high school that had a Pott's fracture. Very typical. So Coley's fracture and Pott's fracture, and then you can read about fractures. You have simple and can't even remember how to classify all the fractures myself, to be honest with you. But you have different classifications of fractures, whether they break through the skin or they don't break through the skin, if they're a twisting spiral motion, or, I mean, they just classify fractures all over the place. Green stick fracture, part way through and all the way through. So convoluted or convoluted fractures or not. So they have all these different ways of classifying fractures. I'm only going to test you on these two fractures. I'm not a fracture expert. Obviously, I can't remember all the classification systems. But if you're going to be in an osteopathy, if you're going to be an osteopathic nurse or some kind of in osteopathic medicine somehow, you're going to have to know all these fractures and how you classify them and things like that. So you'll learn that more in your professional career. Just realize that there's different ways of classifying fractures. All right, what happens when we get old? Well, here's the big thing. If you're female, you have more likelihood of getting osteoporosis. Matter of fact, you're probably going to get osteoporosis. If you're male, you still probably will get osteoporosis, but you have a better chance of avoiding it than a female. And that's all because of the estrogen story in menopause. So let's take a look at osteoporosis.
Bone is living tissue. Bone building is far from complete when a baby is born. During growth, from infancy to adulthood, bone is increased in size, strength, and hardness. Also, in different parts of the body, bones grow at different rates. Bone growth is partly in response to stresses that are put on the bone by weight-bearing motion. The simple acts of walking, running, jumping, and lifting heavy objects put strain on bones that results in increased bone density. Trabecular bone is found in the shaft and at the ends of the long bones, inside the spinal vertebrae, and inside the flat bones of the pelvis. In the ends, trabecular bone completely fills the cavity, and its structure transmits stress forces to the shaft. Trabecular bone forms an internal scaffolding network for bone. The trusses and arches found within the trabecular bone provide for the great strength of bone and yet surprising lightness. The arches and trusses inside trabecular bone provide a sponge-like appearance in the bone and also create the opportunity for blood vessels to penetrate the bone structure from the center core, marrow, of the long bone. Bone remodeling is such a thorough process that one's entire bone structure is replaced approximately every 10 years. Once maturity is reached, about age 30, the process of remodeling slows, and the loss of bone calcium deposits exceeds the replacement of the bone structure. Beyond this point, it is no longer possible to substantially increase bone density. Over time, the density of the arches and trusses diminishes, and the spaces between them become larger. This process leads to a general weakening of the bone structure. It is a very gradual process and requires decades before any noticeable bone weakness appears. Osteoporosis is the end result of the erosion of the arches and trusses. Osteoporotic bone has much larger spaces between the arches and trusses and is significantly weaker than normal bone. Therefore, it is more prone to fracture. This condition is responsible for many injuries related to falls in elderly people. Women are more susceptible to osteoporosis than men. This is probably related to hormonal influence on bone growth and calcification. Also, dietary intake of calcium and other nutrients, including protein, phosphorus, vitamin A, vitamin D, vitamin K, magnesium, zinc, and copper will influence bone density, in that deficiencies will cause decreases. Finally, genetics have an influence on bone density. Here is the progress of bone loss in a person who has taken some precautions related to osteoporosis onset. Note that as the aging process continues, the rate of erosion of the trabecular structure has slowed, and the end result at age 70 is bone that is stronger and denser than a bone with severe osteoporosis. Strategies for preventing osteoporosis are different for young women and older women. Young women should be sure to meet their needs for calcium, vitamin D, and other nutrients. Physical activity of a weight-bearing nature is also important to maintain bone mass. In postmenopausal women, estrogens, estrogen receptor modulators, and calcitonin can slow bone turnover by binding to bone receptors. Calcium supplementation and regular exercise, especially weight-bearing and resistance activities, are important strategies for older people. Finally, since both tobacco smoking and alcohol consumption have negative effects on bone growth, these behaviors should be avoided for healthy bones. In summary, osteoporosis, the weakening of bones due to loss of calcium and phosphorus from the interior of the bone architecture, is a degenerative disease that is influenced by many contributing factors. Health-promoting interventions such as adequate nutrition and physical activity, and medical interventions such as prescription medications designed to limit progress of osteoporosis, coupled with positive behaviors such as not smoking or using alcohol excessively, can forestall the onset and severity of osteoporosis. Men are also at risk for developing osteoporosis. For men, similar prevention strategies apply. These include adequate calcium, vitamin D, and other nutrients, physical activity of a weight-bearing nature, and avoidance of behaviors like smoking and excessive alcohol consumption.
All right, folks, that's the video about osteoporosis, and that's the major thing that happens in elderly, the effects of aging on it. So just remember, women are more susceptible to osteoporosis because of the estrogen story and menopause. When women go through menopause, their estrogen drops down to nothing, whereas men, even when they go through andropause, our testosterone doesn't drop to nothing. It is diminished, but it doesn't completely go away. So we can fight off osteoporosis for longer, if you want to think of it that way. All right. This just shows you the picture of an osteoporotic bone versus a healthy bone. Here's the thing with the elderly. A lot of times you'll hear an elderly person say, I fell down and broke my hip or broke my leg. It's usually when they say hip, they mean the neck of the femur anyway. Well, actually what really happened is the neck of the femur broke and then they fell down. But see, they don't realize that the neck of the femur broke and they fell down. They think that the fall broke their leg. They don't realize it was the other way around. But that's usually what's really happening. And if any of you are EMTs out there, you've had to respond to these. You've probably heard the story before, that the osteoporotic bone breaks and then the elderly person falls down. All right, and then they talked about estrogen replacement therapy and some receptor modulators. And I'm not going to go into specific receptor modulators, but I do want to point this out. Some cancers exacerbate bone loss. All right, so why would that be? Because the cancer cells, the tumor cells, secrete this osteoclast activating factor. And of course, you know what osteoclasts do. Osteoclasts break down bone. So if you have a cancer that releases osteoclast activating factor, now you have a secondary problem, and that is, well, you might have several. Well, cancer is not your only problem, in other words, because now you're going to be breaking down bone, and that's going to lead to weak bones. Let's say you survive cancer. Well, now you got weak bones. But you have another problem. Now you're going to be running high blood calciums all the time, and that's a more immediate problem because that can keep your heart from beating. But I mean, oncologists know this, and they can treat that high blood calcium. It's just that it's not bad enough you're fighting cancer, but even if you beat the cancer and go into remission, now you got a bone problem, and you got osteopenia or osteoporosis. All right, that's it, folks. I'll see you in the next chapter.